Right, chapter 4. This is about some religious strife and social upheavals that were happening between the years of 1680 and 1754 in the colonies. So the first part of the chapter, it's the question that's kind of posed, but it's also the subchapter in this chapter called an ungodly society. And you have to remember, this is at a time when superstition is still a big part of colonial life. Really don't have like the scientific breakthroughs happening just yet. The Enlightenment isn't quite taking hold here in the colonies just yet. That scientific thinking and reasoning that goes along with the Enlightenment. So keep that in mind. I mean, we're going to look back at some of the things that are happening in the chapter and be like, that was so, like, how could they not know? But the rise of some of these religious anxieties came really from the devout faith that people had who lived in the colonies. And citing evidence of increased attention to luxury, the Puritan minister Samuel Sewall warned that economic activities were taking the place of religious devotion. People are too tied to material things and not really, people are starting to move away from the church. Remember, a lot of our colonies were based on religious beliefs. And keep in mind, people were coming to the New World to practice their religion. So we have a lot of colonial life. The center of that colonial life is the church. And when people start paying more attention to luxury and these material goods and start moving away from the church, then the church is like, what's going on? Why are we losing members? Why are people straying as such? So the Reverend Cotton Mather was among those who tried to blend this traditional Puritanism with the new scientific ideas that are happening with the Enlightenment, and also the new consumerism available through participation in the British Empire. However, we still have a lot of Indian attacks happening, and that really heightened fears that demonic forces were at work in New England. Because you have to keep in mind, they see Indians as barbarians and sometimes as workers of the devil. They don't see them as people, and they also don't think, I've invaded Indian land. Indians are acting in retaliation, trying to take back what is theirs. They don't view it that way. They believe that they are there on this new land because that's what God intended for them to do, and God intended for them to take over this land. So those Indian attacks, they feel like those are demonic forces at work. And it's not going to help that we are also going to see cries of witchcraft. So there is this belief in witchcraft, and it is centuries old, and it started in the old world, and it's going to come here to the new world. And it sprang up from a general belief that supernatural forces were responsible for unexplained or unusual events. Oh, you got sick and no one can explain it, and then everyone in your family died? That's got to be like someone put a curse on you, or that's got to be demonic forces at work. And a lot of times, individuals who fell outside of cultural norms were usually the first people accused of witchcraft. So usually it's not always, but 95% of the time, it's going to be women who live on the fringes of society, meaning they're kind of an outcast in their village or in their town. They're kind of like the old hag, if you will, and they don't really intermix with other people, maybe because they're poor, or maybe because everyone else in their family has died and they kind of have been pushed to the outside of their community. Those are going to be the ones accused of witchcraft, those that are just different. And this increased stress of economic competition that came with being part of the British Empire, that colonial expansion and conflicts with Indians, it really led to an upsurge in witchcraft accusations. And between the years of 1647 and 1692, 160 people, most of whom were women, were accused of witchcraft in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, and 15 people were executed. The Salem witch trials, those are probably the most infamous that we know about. Those are in the early 1690s, and they illustrate how the confluence of economic change, social tensions, and fear of Indian attacks persuaded colonists to believe in these accusations of witchcraft. Witchcraft allegations in Salem emerged from social and political uncertainties and local quarrels over the choice of a new minister. More than 100 people were accused of witchcraft, including a minister, respectable church God-fearing women, a wealthy merchant, and even a 4-year-old child was accused of witchcraft. And in order to convict these people of being witches, they used what's known as spectral evidence. And spectral evidence, that was used to convict 20 people, most of them women. 19 people were hanged, and 1 man was pressed to death. So spectral evidence, that's when you have someone in the courtroom who could see things that other people couldn't. So you'd have this young girl sitting down and she would say, there's a demon amongst us. There's a spirit in here and no one could see it but her. That type of evidence was legal to use in the court of law in colonial times. It is going to be removed. They're going to put a law banning spectral evidence. It has to be actual physical evidence from now on. But that spectral evidence, it was used, and that's how many people are convicted of witchcraft. The one that was pressed to death, that was a man who was pressed to death. And what that means is they laid him down and they piled stones on him until he was literally crushed to death from the weight of the stones. And this was a long, agonizing death. This wasn't something that happened very quickly. This took hours, even days, for him to die. Massachusetts Governor William Phips, he stopped the trials when more prominent families began to be targeted, and that's when spectral evidence was eventually discredited. It got all the way to his wife was being accused of being a witch, and that's when he was like, yeah, no, we're going to stop this now. When it was amongst the lower classes, really wasn't like they let it run wild, but when those wealthy merchant and even like the governor's wife starts to become targeted, that's when they're going to stop it. The witchcraft accusations in North America, they're largely confined to the New England area, and they died out around 1700. But for many of the young women in Salem, accusing others of witchcraft was a way for them to release anxiety related to financial insecurity and marriage prospects. There are several primary sources that deal with witchcraft in this chapter. I encourage you to read them just to hear like the testimony and the different viewpoints of the witchcraft and these women that are being accused. Kind of gives you like a better understanding of what exactly was going on in Salem at that time. So let's kind of talk about why this anxiety among women, why it was increasing or starting to increase, that anxiety. What was the big deal? Well, in the early years of settlement in the Chesapeake, the scarcity of women ensured that those women who survived gained greater economic and legal status. In New England, women were recognized as crucial to their husband's business success. So a lot of times what's going on is there would be so few women that they had the ability to really move up in society. So you could be a woman from a low socioeconomic status, a woman of like poor wealth, right? You could be a poor person. But because there aren't enough women to go around for every man, you could be in that lower class, but you could marry into like the middle or the upper class very easily because you're the only woman maybe in your village that's of marrying age at the time, and you've got like 20 guys that are ready to get married. So it was really easy to move up in that social status. But by 1700, the sex ratio in the Chesapeake had been corrected, and women began to lose the economic and social options of earlier times. Slavery and indentured servitude diminished the importance of female labor, and the growth of commerce in colonial cities turned women into consumers rather than producers. So you can see how women's status is slowly starting to change over time. According to law, a married woman was femme couverte and had no independent legal status or economic status. She's legally covered by her husband. So her husband controls every aspect of her life. The patriarchal family, that's where the man is the head of household, came to be seen as a bulwark against disorder and as a way to enhance family wealth. Most women, whether married or not, were controlled by a male relative. What about in working families? I mean, the same is true. Husbands are still like the legal guardians of their wives, but we see more of a balance in these working families between the husband and the wife, mainly because the wife did have to do a lot of the work in order to support the family, just like the husband. So in colonial society, husbands and wives depended on each other to support the family. Not only did the wives of artisans learn aspects of their husband's craft, but they also supervise apprentices and other employees, and together with their husbands, they provided good examples of labor, thrift, and godliness for their subordinates. Family farmers were not self-sufficient. Rather, they relied on the additional labor of servants, slaves, or hired hands, and they participated in broader economic exchange with their neighbors by selling like their surplus crops in order to purchase manufactured goods. So I don't have any cash on me, but I do have this surplus of corn. I'm going to go sell it to the guy who has tons of tobacco, but he doesn't have any corn. corn that they can eat. So he goes and I'm going to sell my corn to that guy and I've just made like 10 shillings. Well, now I can go and I can buy some manufactured goods. I can buy something to store my surplus corn in now, or I can buy a new dress for my wife or my daughter. So that's what that whole exchanging goods with neighbors and selling your surplus. Farm families cooperated with each other in creating an economy of mutual dependence, and farmers and their wives participated in a barter system of exchange because they didn't have the cash flow. So that's okay. We can exchange some of your goods for some of my goods, and that's how we're going to be successful. What about reproduction and women's roles? So most women spent the first 20 years of marriage giving birth to and raising children, because there is at a time when it's common to have 7, 8, 12 kids. But by 1700, women in New England gave birth to an average of 8 children, and most of those survived to adulthood. Initially, mortality rates were higher and birth rates were lower in the Chesapeake due to persistent sex imbalance. After another generation, white women throughout the colonies had similar reproductive rates. Wealthy women had the advantage of retaining servants and wet nurses. Most women simply combined childbearing and child rearing with their other duties. Children in rural homes avoided many of the sanitation problems that flourish in crowded cities, and they're able to live longer and healthier lives. The death rate of women in childbirth was 1 in 30. And widowers with young children usually married again very quickly because someone has to help take care of these children. So we do see like blended families. That was very common during this time. Fathers were legal guardians of their children, so they needed someone to help, and that's also saying, yes, they do need someone to help if they become a widower and their wife dies in childbirth, but also a lot of times in divorce, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, divorce, usually children would go to the father, not the mother. But let's talk about that limit of patriarchal order, limit of that male authority. So many kinds of evidence from the era, cautionary sermons, ads for runaways, and divorce petitions, for example, demonstrate the ideal of male authority over subordinates, and family members did not correspond with reality. Tension centered on issues of control by men in their roles as husbands, fathers, and employers. Women accusing men of abuse. They had 2 possible avenues of redress: gossip and legal sanctions. Gossip could be used to damage the abuser's reputation, which in turn could hurt his economic standing. The courts might become involved in the event of physical or sexual abuse or to insist on support of illegitimate children. Although colonial law did allow for divorce, few divorces were granted, mainly because they were expensive and people could not afford a divorce. If one was granted, the wife was given some financial support, but the husband kept custody of any children. Because divorce was so rare, because it was so expensive and it was just hard to do, abandonment was very common. Again, such a strategy disadvantaged women because they lacked means to support themselves or their children. Because this is at a time when we're seeing less and less women working outside of the home. Really, their main priority is to take care of the children. They have no financial income coming in. So if your husband leaves you and you've got 8 kids, how are you supposed to create enough revenue for children when you don't know how to work? So women who did obtain divorces had to bring multiple charges against their husband, and physical abuse was the hardest one to prove and rarely punished since the law permitted a husband to correct his wife's behavior. You could beat your wife. You could keep her in line by physical abuse. That's not against the law at this time. Also, we're going to talk later on about sexual abuse and how that was kind of, the definition of rape has changed over time. But at this time, just because your husband beat you, that wasn't grounds for divorce since it was legal. This is advertising a married couple separation because the divorce is probably too expensive. So John Creed put this ad in the paper and it says, "Whereas Elizabeth, the wife of John Creed of Buckington Township, Bucks County, may probably run me in debt. This is therefore to inform all persons not to give her credit on my account, because I'm not going to pay any debts she may contract. We having separated from each other by consent now for 20 years. So this is also, there's an old law, I'm not sure if it's still around. I know it was around in Texas up until just recently. You used to have to publish your divorce in 3 separate news outlets, so usually 3 separate newspapers announcing your divorce. And this is one of the reasons why, because that person would Elizabeth here apparently is going to stores and running up credit under her husband's name, but he's like, we haven't been together in 20 years and I can't pay her debts. So please quit putting, do not let her open a tab in my name anymore. It's always my favorite. All right. Just continuing on the limits of patriarchal order. So if a single woman became pregnant, her father could sue the father of her child for financial support. And the court seemed favorably disposed to this kind of suit, particularly when the mother drew the support of other members of her community. So like having other people witness that, yes, he is the father, that kind of thing. Rape that was very difficult to prove in court because it was a capital crime and juries were reluctant to convict the defendant. And as a result, women were reluctant to bring charges, and in many cases, rape charges were downgraded to a lesser offense. Class and race often determined whether a charge of rape or a lesser sexual offense was taken seriously. By the mid-18th century, children were exerting more control over their own lives and were able to move away from their parental home because of the availability of land. But separation from families also meant that women had less protection from potential sexual abuse. Without access to the courts, servants, slaves, and the poor ran away to escape abuse or an unhappy marriage. For most servants and slaves, the consequences of getting caught could be severe, but colonial expansion may have enhanced the chance of success for those fleeing a marriage. Now we're moving into talking a little bit about diversity and competition in colonial societies. So let's talk about population growth and how that leads to economic competition. So due to natural reproduction and increased immigration from Europe and Africa, the population of England's North American colonies grew from 250,000 in 1700 to 2.5 million in 75 years. So 2.5 million in 1775. The population was young and had a high birth rate due to increasing numbers of women and children arriving in the colonies. The American colonists had a healthier diet than their European counterparts and had access to numerous natural resources, resulting in a longer average lifespan. The population growth made it more difficult for younger generations to own land or start businesses just because we were running out of room. Those who owned land were not always prosperous, as the land was often exhausted because they're not doing crop rotation, and some of this land is generally unsuitable for farming or could have been claimed by Indians on the frontier because it technically is their land. In the Carolinas, farmers had to rent suitable land, further limiting their profits. In areas such as Pennsylvania, those without land migrated to Philadelphia and other cities in search of work. Newcomers, however, found the labor market flooded. Just too many laborers coming over. And we start to see a gap between rich and poor increasing in the early 18th century. In the Chesapeake, landowners who could control the labor of many slaves could get rich from the production of tobacco. They developed a trading network in North America and the Caribbean and imported luxury goods from Europe. Because of tobacco, a higher percentage of whites owned land in the South than did whites in the North. 2/3 of all whites owned land in Virginia, and the percentage was even higher in the Carolinas. But widespread land ownership masked the dependence of small farmers on large landowners who controlled the economic and political life of the colonies. Urban artisans worked for wealthy merchants, and tenant farmers were completely dependent on the owners of the land they farmed. 1/5 of all Southerners were poor, or were only one bad crop away from destitution. Moreover, economic opportunities for free blacks decreased, and slaves found their opportunities for freedom virtually eliminated. But we do see some increasing diversity, and new immigrants and slaves made the colonies more diverse. Immigrants arriving from Ireland, Scotland, the German states, Sweden, and the Caribbean, as well as England, populated mainland English colonies, and settlers from France and Spain joined American Indians in populating the frontier. The booming population increased pressure for land, and new immigrants moved further and further into the frontier. Colonists and Indians negotiated with each other to secure land. Along the Pennsylvania frontier, the lines between native and English settlements were blurred, but many immigrant and native communities developed prosperous trading relations with each other. So then in the 1720s and the 1730s, Scotch-Irish immigrants arrived in such high numbers that they overwhelmed the native communities. After William Penn died in 1718, his descendants struggled to establish control over Pennsylvania, and as more and more Europeans came into the colony, Indians were pushed further into frontier territories. So they're pushing further into new territories, right? So there's going to be some expansion, but with that expansion comes conflict. And the rising population on the frontier caused conflicts between old and new settlers and among different immigrant groups. German, Scot-Irish, and Dutch settlers in Pennsylvania fought with each other both in and out of court, and longtime English settlers feared the social consequences of having so many new immigrants. After the death of William Penn, like I said, Pennsylvania officials were interested in getting Indian land by any means necessary, and they took advantage of the upheaval within the Iroquois Confederacy to assert control over the Delaware Indians. The walking purchase of 1737, it originated when colonial authorities found, in quotes there, they found an alleged treaty between Penn and the Iroquois that gave the English control over as much land as could be walked off in a day and a half. They just made this up, in case you couldn't get the context there. In the end, Pennsylvania officials were able to claim even more land than the treaty had originally specified, because what they do is they actually send several people on horseback. So they're not technically walking, as it said in the treaty that they found. Instead, they're on horseback and they're racing to see how far they can go in 24 hours so that they can claim more land. Such rapid expansion like that, though, it did cause more conflicts between colonists and Indians as the dispute over boundaries and contracts continued. Settlers, however, claimed land simply by building houses and planting crops. They didn't get anyone permission to do that, they just did it. And the religious diversity of the recent immigrants added a new dimension to Indian colonial relations. Several groups, such as the Quakers, developed friendly relations with local Indians in order to buy land and establish trade. These alliances were based less on religion and more on economics, as both Indians and colonists hoped to profit from the fur trade. So you can find this map in your book. I just want you to kind of notice several things about this. So this is map 4.1. If you went and bought the textbook, it's on page 121. In my textbook, it should be the same as yours, hopefully. But again, just look for map 4.1. So this is just showing these, the white settlement. And a lot of this is Pennsylvania, in case you can't read it right there. But you'll notice the white settlement, for the most part, they're kind of concentrated in the southeastern part of the state here. But also, notice how many Indian settlements there are. And in the 1720s and 1730s, all this European migration, it's really starting to escalate dramatically in the fertile river valleys, which you can kind of see that's where they are, right? They're settled on the rivers or in these valleys where it's very fertile land. And in response, these once independent Indian tribes that are kind of throughout all of this area, what they end up doing are joining larger, more powerful tribes such as the Delaware and the Shawnee, and they join those nations to strengthen their position against the influx of these colonists. But back to this expansion and conflict. So we do see some different religious views among the various settlers that made it more difficult for them to find common ground in Indian relations. Tensions also existed between the French and the English officials in the area. As the religious diversity in the colonies grew, different religious groups established their own schools and churches, and not only in Pennsylvania, but also in the Carolinas and Georgia. Puritans remained deeply suspicious of other Protestants, other Christians, and most of these sects tried to isolate themselves from other religious and ethnic groups. Some religious groups were isolated by force as much as by choice. After thousands of Scottish Catholics were transported to the Carolinas in 1745 following a failed rebellion, even long-settled Catholics in Maryland and elsewhere were viewed with suspicion by Protestants. Small but enduring Jewish communities resided in the colonies by 1750. They were able to build a multitude of successful mercantile ventures. The importation of African slaves added to this religious diversity because they're bringing their own religions with them from Africa. And although some slaves were Catholic or Muslim, many adhered to their traditional African religious traditions. And that kind of sets the stage for these religious awakenings that are happening. And we have the roots of what is called the Great Awakening. So the explosion of competing Protestant sects and the impact of the Enlightenment emphasized rational and scientific thinking, and that created a greater tolerance for religious diversity. German Pietism, that was a belief in more intense and personal religious expression that arose in opposition to trends of toleration and influenced many throughout Europe, including Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and also a gentleman by the name of George Whitefield. So keep him in the back of your head. We're going to come back to Whitefield in just a second. Laymen and clergy had become concerned with the state of colonial religion by 1700, and so we see this a lack of clergy in rural areas discourage potential adherents because there's just no one there to like talk to them about church or to try to go out and say, hey, come to church on Sunday. There's no one there. So urban churches, they didn't do a very good job either because they really reflected class divisions, and their clergy did little to serve the needs of non-elite parishioners. There's a couple of guys that we're going to talk about just really quickly. The first is Theodorus Frelinghuysen. He is going to be preaching primarily in New Jersey. We have William Tennent, who is in Pennsylvania. Both of those supported a more emotional approach to religion. And concerned that ministers were too few in number, Tennent established a school to train men for the clergy. And Jonathan Edwards, he led a revival in Massachusetts in which he emphasized emotion over logic. So again, what's happening here are these people living in the colonies were starting to stray further and further from church, and they could kind of see what the church was doing. They were only catering to the really wealthy because the wealthy were lining the pockets of the clergymen. And what we start to see happening when George Whitefield arrives, he is going to start preaching that salvation is not just for the wealthy. It's not for those who can afford it, but really it's for everyone. And we start to see people returning to the church and people really starting to act Christian, if you will, again. Tennant's son, his name is Gilbert, and he continued his father's work, and he came to embrace Frelinghuysen's emphasis on personal spiritual rebirth. Eventually, he met Whitefield, and George Whitefield, his revivals transform religion in the colonies. And this was a really big deal, this transformation that we're going to see taking place in the colonies. Whitefield successfully initiated what later became known as the Great Awakening because he understood and used communication networks. At first, he would go from town to town, village to village, and he would preach inside these churches, the actual physical church. But over time, the ministers didn't really agree with what he was saying, and that was okay because he was drawing in huge crowds with thousands of people. So he started preaching outside. One, because the ministers around didn't want him in their church, and two, because the crowds were so large, that was really the only way for him to preach. And he's known as an itinerant preacher, which means like a traveling preacher. He went from one place to the next. And he traveled throughout the colonies, inspiring some ministers along the way. His greatest success came during a 15-month preaching tour that began in 1739. Declaiming on the ideology of personal emotional religiosity, he attracted thousands to his sermons. Inspired by Whitefield, New Light ministers were denounced, more educated and less emotional clergy, and they held massive outdoor services and attracted colonists from all social classes. Many became itinerant preachers, meaning they traveled everywhere, and this new style of religion, prompted by New Light clergy, attracted thousands of young adherents as well as many poor parishioners who appreciated the egalitarian nature of their revivals, meaning it's not just for the elite, it's for everyone. Even the poor can come to this, because in churches before the Great Awakening, what would happen is you'd literally have to buy where you sat in church. And who do you think is going to sit at the very front? It's going to be the people that can afford it. They're literally paying for that seat. But during the Great Awakening, it was open to everyone. You didn't have to pay to sit up front. And so the poor found themselves, gravitating towards the front when these revivals were going on. And it was about preaching, we're all equal here. Egalitarianism, we're all on equal footing. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're not going to get in heaven because you didn't buy your way in. That's not how religion works. Let's see if I can get it to the next slide here. There we go. After initially welcoming these revivals, established ministers began opposing their itinerants because New Light adherents were splitting from these established congregations. Moreover, the appeal to egalitarianism caused many conservatives to fear a social disorder. Oh no, the church is saying that we're all equal. How am I going to keep controlling the poor? So James Davenport, one of the most radical preachers, was so extreme in his attacks on clerical corruption that he attracted both criminal charges and the the approbation of other New Light ministers. Davenport's actions convinced colonial authorities that the revivalism could not continue unchecked. So Tennant was critical of Davenport and reasserted the value of pietistic communion. The revivals lessened in intensity over time, and religious institutions became more ordered. However, the central features of revivalism tended to work against its institutionalization. The influence of the Great Awakening was reflected more in attitude and practice than in institutions. Both New Light and Old Light adherents found common cause, though, when King George II threatened to appoint an Anglican bishop for the American colonies. Colonial elites and non-elites feared the imposition of new authority, but revivalists had honed a mode of communication that would facilitate a rapid and pervasive response to what colonists regarded as potential tyranny. Just to give you an idea of some of the diversity happening, this is map 4.2. You can find this in your textbook. And what I want you to notice is just the different colors there. Despite the universal appeal of Whitefield, religious diversity really had began to increase by 1750, and this just shows you that increase. We've got some Baptist churches beginning to multiply in New England. Presbyterian and Lutheran churches spread across the South. And then we even have non-evangelical houses of worship, such as the Quaker Meeting House and Jewish synagogues. Those also gradually increased in number, and you can kind of see where all these are taking place in this map here. Okay, changing political relations, like how that influence happened. So we had the social awakenings, now we're going to have political awakenings. In local government, it also became more complex in the 18th century as colonies grew. Most colonial officials were men of wealth and property who had some power locally, but ultimate sovereignty over the colonies, like those making the decisions, and issues of war and peace rested back across the Atlantic with the king and parliament. Distance made it virtually impossible for Parliament to rigidly control the colonies. Royal officials recognized the need for compromise in institutions of local government. Town meetings in Massachusetts Bay and the House of Burgesses in Virginia gave colonists some control over their own lives. A tradition of difference, however, promoted the expectation that most people would yield to authority, and although colonial governments minimize opposition by conducting public elections, most public officials continue to be men of wealth and property. Again, kind of like our politicians today. At the national level, a lot of those politicians come from wealthy, powerful families. Locally, we do have more of your middle class people that are holding office in local politics. But this difference was not absolute. Although scattered challenges to establish authority existed in the 17th and early 18th centuries, the ideas brought forth by the Great Awakening converged with changing political views, and resistance to authority became more common. Beginning in the 1730s, many colonists, including women, the poor, and African Americans, engaged in more frequent protests against authority. The targets of these protests were both royal and local officials, merchants, and the wealthy. Increasingly, the protests focused on the belief that all colonists, even non-elites, had rights worth protecting. More colonists began engaging in collective action to protest threats to their to their economic autonomy. Women, in their role as consumers, led a lot of these riots that protested an increase in bread prices at a time of economic recession. They attacked grain warehouses and retail establishments. However, though the riots were initially successful in reducing prices, the price of bread continued to rise over long term. Likewise, conflicts between small and large farmers erupted, as when Boston tried to conduct a public market and charge farmers for market space, placing smaller producers at a disadvantage. Consumers saw the market as an excuse to raise prices and sided with the protesting farmers. When appeals to local authorities failed, opponents of the market burned down the stalls in the middle of the night. And although this protest failed in the long term because the market was rebuilt, the power of collective protest was undeniable. You get enough people protesting, you can make some change. Colonists were also fighting for access to land. In the 1740s, tenants in New Jersey and New York protested the policies of landlords and the amount of land claimed by speculators. When petitions for redress failed, the protesters burned outbuildings, they attacked livestock, they looted the homes of targeted landlords. The protesters eventually established committees to hear tenant grievances and former popular militia companies and courts to deal with uncooperative landlords. Officials and landlords found that local militia were useless in controlling the rioters because militia members were themselves often engaged in some of these protests. Impressment, that was a focus of protests in colonial seaports. Impressed sailors faced a miserable existence and a high rate of mortality in the Royal Navy, and in 1747 men in Boston fought back by rioting for 3 days. Although impressment did not end, the riots demonstrated that colonists would not simply accept actions detrimental to their liberty. Impressment, that is when the British Navy, they were coming into seaports in American colonies, and they were literally kidnapping men. They would go to pubs, they would go to catch these men while they were drinking or walking out on the streets and force them into military service. And for some of these men, it is a death sentence to serve in the Navy during this time period. And they realize that, like, you're going in and you're just taking, like, fathers and throwing them on the ship, and the moms, the wives don't know where they are. And that's a life sentence that you've given a lot of these men. So colonists are going to begin protesting impressment. Economic uncertainty combined with the egalitarian ideology of the Great Awakening, that we're all equal, that produced more protests against local and British officials. Though many protests evinced increased animosity along class lines, the fight against impressment demonstrated that colonists of different socioeconomic groups could join together to oppose actions that threatened all. And that coming together, we're going to see a transformation happening in urban politics. And these cross-class alliances became really visible in colonial politics in the 1730s and 1740s. In many cases, different groups of elites sought the support of non-elites, the poor class, in an attempt to appeal to the popular will. In New York City, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers gained the right to vote, and some even obtained local office. Laborers in New York City did not vote in large numbers until 1733, when Lewis Morris tried to mobilize opposition to Governor William Cosby. Morris, a wealthy judge, ran for a seat on the New York Assembly, presenting himself as fighting for the common man against corrupt royal officials in New York. And he was able to get votes from the laboring class, and he wins. His supporters then launched the New York Weekly Journal, and that was a political publication that was published by John Peter Zenger. Zenger then, in this publication, he accused Governor Cosby and his administration of corruption and election fraud, among some other things. Zenger's published attacks led to his arrest and imprisonment on charges of seditious libel in November of 1734. By law, any published material that was found to undermine governmental authority was considered libelous, whether it was true or not. So what Zenger does is he's publishing the truth, but it's undermining government authority. So at trial, Zenger, his attorney, a guy by the name of Andrew Hamilton, argued that the truth was a valid defense against libel charges. In violation of existing law, the jury acquitted Zenger. They were like, they're right. Although you're not supposed to undermine the government, the truth, that's a valid defense. And so they let him off. The Zenger case, although it did not change British law, it did demonstrate the willingness of colonial juries to side with their fellow colonists in disputes against British authority. Zenger was appointed the official printer of the New York Assembly. As the Morris faction continued to gain power, that power was short-lived, however, as British officials began wooing some of the leading Morrisites with lucrative royal appointments. Morris himself changed sides when he was offered the royal governorship of New Jersey. The determination of ordinary people to affect their own futures, however, that does not ease. Various publications, including Zenger's, continued to attack corrupt officials and expose threats to rights of British colonists. The real power of ordinary freedmen depended on a divided elite, but in some cases their victories only exacerbated class divisions. Lewis Morris was instrumental in getting New York City's first almshouse built in 1736, a project that put many laborers and artisans to work in a period of high unemployment. The almshouse, however, became a visible symbol of economic inequality and an excuse for city officials to eliminate other forms of aid for the poor. The expansion of the transatlantic trade ensured that wealthier colonists had growing access to silver plates, clocks, tea services, bed, table linens, and other luxury goods. With British exports extending more credit to colonial merchants and affluent white consumers, the division between rich and poor became increasingly visible to all colonists of all backgrounds. And the last thing I want to end on with this chapter is this picture. Hopefully it'll go to it for me. This picture, this is George Whitefield preaching, right? This is in 1760. And notice the group that's there. You have a woman here. You can see some officials here, but also this guy's my favorite. Cheersing Whitfield, it almost looks like, with like cider or mead or some type of drink. But notice, I mean, it's people, it's old, it's young, it's the poor, it's the wealthy. He attracted all these different people from all these different classes. And he's preaching like we're all equal. We're all equal in God's eyes. That was something that was new, that had not been really preached before to large groups of people.